Aloha, I'm Lyla Berg. Mahalo for tuning into Island Focus. We're recording this program remotely so that you can hear from the leaders in our community about the viability and reality of agriculture as part of Hawaii's economy. Thank you for being with us on Island Focus. When you speak about providing food for our islands, how does that work?
So there's a lot that the ranchers do to get that beef from the ranch to your plate. It's actually a pretty complicated chain of events that I think not a lot of people understand. But the good thing is that people are starting to support local beef a lot more, realizing that if we support our ranchers, then they're able to provide a lot more to our community. We have about 10 processing facilities in the state. We are able to provide what the processing plants have the capacity to do within any given month. The ranchers work with that, and there are other ranchers who have cow-calf operations. So these are operations where they don't necessarily have the forage quality or the amount of space to be able to produce grass-fed beef at this moment. But with the increased support for that local beef, a lot of these ranchers are able to get those other variables up, like the processing capacity, to be able to provide more for our community.
Cattle ranching requires land as well as water. Those resources are so precious to us here in Hawaii, and people say they're limited. But as we know, we have a lot of capacity. How does the land concerns play into the work that you do?
One of the biggest issues is access to land and having those lease terms for those who lease that makes them confident in being able to continue their operation. So there's actually a bill back in 2003, so 18 years ago now. Act 90 was passed in 2003, and it was a way to make sure that there would be long-term production of agricultural lands in the state. And what Act 90 did was it said that agricultural lands that are currently under the Department of Land and Natural Resources should be transferred to the Department of Agriculture. This makes sense because the Department of Agriculture, their mission is to support food production. The DLNR has a very important mission, but it doesn't include food production. In addition to that, the leases under the DLNR are not based on agricultural production. They're based on highest and best use, which means that the rent values are a lot more than a cattle rancher can handle. A lot of times they're short because they're not for agriculture. So they might be 30-day revocable permits. These things make it very difficult for a rancher to plan. Ranchers usually work on long-term scales, planning multiple years in advance. The other thing with having confidence in their lease terms is that they're able to put in these investments into infrastructure like water, like fencing, like improving the roads. These are all things that are a benefit for the whole community. But with short-term leases, it's kind of silly to be making those risky investments unless you know that you'll be able to continue your business into the future.
Implementation of a law that was passed 18 years ago is necessary at the moment. But also when we're talking about the sustainability of the cattle business, what paradigm shift do we need to have?
I think that that's an important thing that we need from the community is educating folks to realize that, yes, ranchers provide food, but they're also there as a big contributor to the economy. Cattle is often in the top 10 of Hawaii's top agricultural commodities. They provide a lot of jobs. In the COVID pandemic, they were able to stand up and feed the community at a moment's notice. The Hawaii Cattlemen's Council organized a donation. We got in over 20,000 pounds of beef donated to the Salvation Army for families in need. That's over 60,000 hot meals. And that was just what we organized. Outside of what we organized, we know that there were ranchers, large and small, making those donations. And so knowing that the ranchers are able to do this, we need to make sure that we keep as much agricultural lands in agricultural production as possible, because they're the ones who are here when crisis hits to be able to support the community.
You know, Nicole, recently we've seen the demise of Love's Bakery, one of our long-standing industries here. The cattle industry is equally as important. Can you share what we need to be paying attention to and what we can do to preserve and make sure that the cattle industry maintains itself?
When Love's Bakery closed down, it was really alarming. That's an industry that provides us with food here in the islands for the islands. That's something that cattle ranchers do as well. And I think that recognizing that being able to support ourselves from within the islands is important, and hoping that we get more advocacy for keeping agricultural lands in agriculture. It's really easy to change the use of an agricultural land to something else that might produce more money, but what is the cost of no longer being able to produce food for our islands? And when lands are no longer managed for agriculture, it's really difficult to get it back into working order if you wanted to revert back to it. So a lot of what we do with the Hawaii Cattlemen's Council is make sure that we get all of our voices together to advocate for agricultural lands staying in agricultural production.
Well, and I really appreciate you sharing the generosity and the vision that the Cattlemen's Council has in terms of helping to take care of the community, because that's really what the show is about. How do we help each other take care of each other? Some parting words as we end our conversation today.
Ranchers are here day in and day out on the ground stewarding the land. That's not just providing you food, but that's providing all the ecosystem services that you might not think of, but are being spread to the wider community as a whole. And I'd like to look at cattle ranching and well-managed rangelands as a way to help us through climate change and making sure that our community is provided for, as well as our land taken care of every day.
Well, let's see if we can get those lands that are currently under DLNR transferred where they belong, to the Department of Agriculture. And thank you so much for sharing your time and educating us to what is available and how we can support the Cattlemen's Association.
I so appreciated being here talking with you. Thank you.
Mahalo for joining me in meeting Nicole Galase, Managing Director for the Hawaii Cattlemen's Council. Mahalo for joining us, Kamana. Thank you so much for taking the time to help us understand where we are with agriculture and land and water. Can you explain a little bit more your perspective from your various roles?
Sure. I think the most important message for me for today is that food sovereignty, food security for our islands is a must-have. And we must change the way that we do business in our islands. We must better support the innovation and brilliance of our local farmers, our aloha aina practitioners, really for the future of our islands. And tied to that is, our ancestral agricultural system and approaches of aloha aina, the ahupua'a system that really integrates what happens up Mauka and, the aquaculture lokoi'a systems, makai, are incredibly viable. And we need to build off of these systems for a more resilient and equitable Hawaii in regards to agriculture. Because of the brilliant work of people like, Dr. Natalie Kurashima, UH Manoa, Dr. Noah Lincoln, Dr. Kavika Winter, it's entirely certain that, we fed more people in Hawaii through that ancestral agricultural system than we do in our islands today. That ancestral agriculture system is more efficient than conventional agriculture, and it's more climate resilient. Using only 6% of our lands in Hawaii, we produce enough food to support 86% of Hawaii's population today. Whereas so-called conventional or industrial agriculture today uses nearly 4 times as much land, and it only produces about 13% of the food we consume in our islands. So we need a radical shift, for the future of our islands. But the beauty is, it's not shooting in the dark. It's absolutely viable. And it's not that radical because it's returning and building off of the systems that we know worked for these islands.
We also have the concern about water and the carrying capacity with the focus on construction, tourism, the industries that require a lot of people. How does that interplay with your vision for agriculture?
I'm finishing my second term, my 8th year on the Hawaii State Water Resource Management Commission. And in fact, next month will be my final meeting. But over the course of the last 8 years, we've restored over 45 streams all across our islands and really rebalanced, in some cases, streams that have been dry for 120 plus years because of plantation, agriculture, and monocropping. And we're rebalancing, giving water back to the needs of the stream, the precious Oʻahu and Hihivai and Ōpai that need, and we've seen that resilience restored, in areas, for instance, like West Maui. Some streams there we thought, wouldn't reach Makai and wouldn't have connectivity. And in fact, we've seen like the restoration of Oʻahu, so much so that because of this amazing community leadership, they're saying, hey, now we got to figure out, better manage the Oʻahu we thought we'd never have. So we do need to rebalance water. That is a critical part of food sovereignty for our islands. And we're in the midst of doing that on the Water Commission. But what I want to say is that, communities need to be empowered and know where your water comes from. In many cases, there's old diversions that, taking water out of the streams that need to be updated and upgraded and rebalanced.
So what are some of the questions that the community needs to ask elected leaders, the industry leaders?
We need to ask when we do redesignate land areas, when we're saying we're using lands for agriculture, is it feeding our people? We definitely want a resilient and equitable economy with, meaningful work and livable wages for our people. We need to better support, again, these amazing nonprofits and aloha aina practitioners and small farms all across our islands. Places for me that are like, Waipa Foundation, Ma'o Farms, just so much community resilience. There is this legacy and history of extractive agriculture in our islands, dating back from the plantation system, perhaps even today, when you look at the way we use lands for, just simply genetically modified seed corn, and not much of that is actually feeding people or ever will. And so when we readjust and recalculate our future, we need to think about utilizing these precious lands and the bounties of them actually going to our community to feed people for a more resilient, robust future. And, less of these cash crops, extractive types of agriculture that are outdated and antiquated for our islands.
As we wrap up our conversation for today, I'm very hopeful that the younger generation, even though there's not agriculture in the schools, there is at the university, I'm hopeful that the younger generation sees the viability of agriculture as part of their future professionally.
We have to think a little broader than I think the old silos of agriculture. So it's a much more robust approach to feeding people that is regenerative, that helps malama our islands and our resources. And so if we've seen anything over the last 25 years, it's the incredible restoration and resurrection of our fish ponds, of our lo'i systems, right? And we've seen the ways that not only educates our youth, but empowers them for a better, more resilient future. Coming out of the COVID crisis and the collapse, we saw just that little brief pause, how our natural systems started to restore themselves. We saw the returning of pua to nearshore areas that we hadn't seen, even in Waikiki. Lalakea, white-tip sharks showing up, and that was beautiful and gorgeous. But the youth really are calling for a much more robust system that malamas are kai and vai, but it actually feeds people. And they're really leading the charge in this innovation. The boost in CSAs, for instance, after COVID was amazing, right? I mean, there's all these markets and innovation that are available for us in the future if we rethink agriculture.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. And at the very minimum, at least we can plant vegetables somewhere in our garden or in our friends' yard, and as communities come together and help us feed each other.
Yes, absolutely. I think in rethinking agriculture, we need things that go to the market for sure, but also growing food, sharing food. What a beautiful part of our culture. In some instances, when I was a kid, we never paid for mangoes. We never paid for bananas because it was all gifts, right? And that's something that's actually changed. I remember the first time I saw a mango in the store, I was just amazed that we had to pay for a mango. So growing our own food, sharing with our neighbors, building community, that's also a part of food sovereignty and security and feeding ourselves.
Well, thank you again, and best of luck to you. We'll look forward to more conversations in the future.
Mahalo nui. Take care.
You've just had the opportunity to meet Dr. Kamana Maikalani Beamer with the Center for Hawaiian Studies at the University of Hawaii, Mano. Mahalo for being with us today, Jesse, and representing the vision and mission of Ulu Pono. Can you share a little bit more about how your organization regards food sovereignty and maybe some thoughts on where we can go with that?
Our primary goals is to increase local production for local consumption. And we view it as a question of security for the communities in Hawaii. Right now, we probably depend on imported food by maybe 80 to 90% of our diets. And this leaves us very, very vulnerable to natural disasters or food supply chain disruptions that we experienced during COVID. So for Ulu Pono, the security aspect is very, very important first and foremost. After that, I think it's really about funding and supporting farming organizations that are going to be sustainable, that are going to be profitable, that won't require philanthropic support or government support every single year, but can survive on their own. And that's the type of food organizations we want to see thrive and expand.
And from your position as an analyst of data and information, can you share a little bit more about what you've learned relative to the farming community? We've
spoken previously about the lack of data that's out there right now regarding farming. And there's really, a misconception that we have a lot of these large farmers that are taking up all of the sales or not letting small farmers in the equation. And for us, if you look at the stats, Hawaii is almost all small farmers. Only, I would say, 12% of farmers in Hawaii make over $50,000 in revenue, only 12%. And that 12%, astoundingly, is responsible for 90% of the food production here in Hawaii. So we have some large farmers, but in actuality, they're not very large. The average size of the Hawaii farmer is 3 to 4 times smaller than that of the mainland. So for Hawaii, we really need to try and make these smaller farming operations profitable and sustainable. And what are some of the recommendations or suggestions that you have to that? We can change the laws, of course, and then the law has to be implemented, but concrete ideas. For the farmers, the concrete ideas is just implementing new farming technology like greenhouses, hydroponic methods of farming, mechanized farming. Again, in Hawaii, there's this notion that, we can provide for our people without using tractors or equipment or larger scale agriculture. And it's really not the case given our population and how vulnerable we are. So on the farming side, it's about incorporating technology. On the government side, on the demand side, of course, consumers need to buy more local when they can, of course. The issue has always been pricing. So, that's another issue with supply. When you have a lot of small farmers, you don't have the economies of scale that you would have if you had larger farmers like on the mainland. So a lot of times imports are much less expensive. Also, we need a little bit more government support. I think one of the biggest ways that the government can support farming and at the same time students and their nutritional needs is to implement more local food into school system, implement more local food into the hospital system, into the prison system, and put their money where their mouth is, right? A lot of folks, a lot of politicians talk about agriculture, but there's no real kind of backup. There's no end game for them besides saying, hey, we really believe in farming. But at the end of the day, farming needs some government support. During the pandemic, it was the farmers that started donating to food banks early and often. So you really need that local consumption to be a safety barrier, right? Against these food supply chain disruptions, against disasters. If you don't have local food production, then you're totally dependent on imports, and anything can occur at that point.
Well, and you bring up a very good point, that when crisis comes, we help each other. Hopefully we don't have a lot of more crises, but with climate change and with shipping and all that, we never know. What ideas might you have to encourage the viewing audience to shift their paradigm, to shift how they look at agriculture? We can buy agriculture products, local products, a little more expensive because we believe in supporting the farmers. But what other ideas can you have that really will move the dial ahead?
Well, I think, again, it's really about talking to your local lawmakers, really asking them, hey, what are we doing to support local food production? Fresh food, non-processed food. Why aren't we using more of that type of food with our kids and in student meals in our hospitals? If the state really believes in local food production, where is it supporting local food production? And, besides all of the buy local, which is great, but everybody knows that. I think everybody tries to do it when they can. I think people prefer local when it's at the same price as an imported product or even a little more expensive. But the other things they can do is really talk to their lawmakers and officials and ask, what are you doing to support local? What are your plans to support local in the future?
And how do other businesses, from the visitor industry, construction, how do they play into this?
Oh, businesses are huge, right? I think during the pandemic, it was estimated that the farm sales were down 50%. And the pandemic showed that the restaurant and hotel industry were huge customers of local farming. And when that industry got shut down, local farmers were really in a bad way. So I think, restaurants, hotels, any type of food service organization, if they can implement more local food, that's all the better. And I think most institutions have, because customers really like farm fresh food. They want to know that it's from somebody in Kalihi or Waianae, right? Rather than somebody in Mexico, maybe, or in California. It's better to have that local name on your menu. So businesses, I think, if they can find it at the right price, they'll definitely want local produce and local meat.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your ideas, and Ulupono's mission and vision to help the food sovereignty and help people in Hawaii. So we really appreciate your time, and let's hold the vision as possible.
Thank you so much.
You've just met Jesse Cook, Vice President of Investments and Analytics with the Ulupono Initiative. Mahalo for joining us on Island Focus. I'm Lyla Berg. On behalf of the Island Focus crew and the entire team at Ōlelo Community Media, aloha and malama pono. See you soon.